Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Ardimawan Fikri Wibianto. My study number is 110. In this moment, I want to explain about basic of photography. We already know that photography is all about light. We already know that photography is all about light. That's why we need to adjust the amount of light. How we adjust the amount of light? Step 1. We need a camera, not a motivation. Camera is a basic equipment in photography. You can do photography with even the simplest camera like pocket camera, webcam, and your own smartphone. But I recommend you guys to use a camera that allows you to adjust the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, of course, such as DSLR or maybe mirrorless. This variable called the exposure triangle. Before discuss about exposure triangle, we should talk about exposure. When we talk about exposure, I mean the brightness or darkness of a photo. It seems simple enough to take a photo that is correct exposed, but it can be quite tricky. You know that expose uses aperture, shutter speed, and ISO in conjunction to create a properly exposed image. It's going to be easy if you use automatic mode. And right now, let's discuss the first variable in the exposure triangle. So, first of all, what is aperture? What is a aperture? Aperture defines how large the hole is through. In photography, aperture is measured in units called f-number. All you really need to know is the smaller the f-number, then the largest aperture hole is, and the more light to read the sensor. And then from now on, large aperture I will mean a large aperture hole, and vice versa by small aperture. In practice, depending on the lens you have, you usually use f-number from about f4 to approximately f16. And the larger the depth of field is, the more objects are in focus. So next, what is the shutter speed? The second variable in exposure triangle is shutter speed, also known as exposure time. Stand for the length of time a camera shutter is open to expose the light into the camera sensor. If the shutter speed is fast, it can help to freeze action completely, as seen in the some sport photos. If the shutter speed is slow, it can create an effect called motion blur. There are no frightening f-number in shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in normal second. At bright daylight, we usually use hundredth of a second. When cloudy, in shade or else might be tenth of a second. And at night, it comes to full second. While the shutters open, the sensor records everything it sees. It does not realize what the objects are. It just divides the scene into millions of dots and records the color in every dot during the exposure time. And then for the last variable is ISO. So, what is ISO? ISO is the level of sensitivity of your camera to available light. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitive it is to the light, while the higher number of ISO increase the sensitivity of your camera. If you cannot get the right When you cannot get the right exposure with the aperture and shutter speed, it is the time to think about ISO sensitivity. ISO defines how sensitive the camera sensor is to the light. With the same amount of available light, the higher ISO sensitivity, the more lights will be captured in your sensor. The ISO sensitivity is numbered in number. I mean like number like ISO 100 or maybe ISO 200. I recommend it to get the cleanest photo in your camera. This is what you start with. If you cannot get the right exposure by altering aperture and shutter speed, try to adjust the ISO speed. Aperture and shutter can be reduced the amount of light as much as needed in the most case, with rare exception. There are also ways to reduce the amount of light, such as using a lens filter or else. The ISO sensitivity control is usually useful with light. When the ISO is not enough, like ISO 100 or maybe ISO 200, you should change the ISO number to maybe 400 or maybe 1600 or many else. This is not so simple, however. Aperture and shutter speed control can be considered safe because they alter a natural measure the amount of light. The ISO sensitivity is more artificial. It's increased from a price though. The more sensitivity the sensor becomes, the more image noise it creates. This is what the equipment quality become important in photography, such as Canon 1DX Mark II. Expensive professional camera usually allows much higher ISO speeds before the image noise become prohibitive. So that's it for now. I hope you guys can learn more about photography. Alhamdulillah. See you on top guys. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.